Some women are handed to powerful men like peace offerings, quietly, without ceremony, as though their lives are currencies to be spent. Ariana Greco was 22 years old when her father placed her future in the hands of a man who controlled half of Rome from behind a desk of dark mahogany and silence. She walked into that world expecting a cage. What she did not expect was the way Raphael Santini looked at her. Not like a possession, not like a transaction. Like she was the first thing in years that had made him feel something he couldn't afford. This is the story of a woman who was given no choice, and chose everything anyway. If this kind of story moves you, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let the story begin. The night it began, Rome smelled like rain and old stone. Ariana sat in the back of a black car she hadn't chosen, wearing a dress she hadn't picked, traveling to a dinner she hadn't agreed to. Her hands were folded in her lap with the rigid precision of a woman holding herself together by will alone. Outside the tinted window, the city moved in streaks of amber and gold. Restaurants full of laughing strangers, couples walking close under shared umbrellas, a world entirely unbothered by the fact that her life was being decided for her at a dining table across town. Her father, Enzo Greco, sat beside her in the car saying nothing. He had said everything already, 2 days before, when he had come to her apartment with his hat in his hands and his debt in his eyes. She had known the moment she saw him that something was broken. Not just his finances, but the invisible agreement between a father and a daughter, the one that said he would never trade her for anything. He had broken it quietly, with words like arrangement and alliance and opportunity, and she had sat very still on her couch and listened to the careful way he avoided saying what he actually meant. That he had borrowed money from Raphael Santini and could not pay it back, and that the Santini family had suggested, not demanded, suggested, that a marriage would settle the matter permanently. Suggested. As if she were a footnote in a contract. She had not screamed. She had not cried. She had simply looked at her father for a long, terrible moment and said, "Tell me everything about him." Because Ariana Greco had learned, early and painfully, that the only power available to a woman in a room full of men was information. The car stopped in front of a building that made no attempt at grandeur from the outside. Pale stone, an unmarked door, a single light above it like a quiet warning. This was not the kind of wealth that needed to announce itself. This was the kind that had outlasted empires. Her father adjusted his tie. "He's a reasonable man," Enzo said softly. "You said that about the last business partner who disappeared," she replied, and stepped out of the car before he could answer. The interior was everything the exterior was not. Not ostentatious, but deeply, effortlessly beautiful. Dark wood paneling, low candlelight, art on the walls that looked original because it was a room that said power the way a cathedral said faith. Through accumulated weight, through the sense that the space had been shaped by generations of certainty. A man stood at the far end of the room. She had expected someone older. Softer. The kind of man who bought power because he couldn't earn it naturally. What she found instead was Raphael Santini at 34, tall, dark-suited, standing with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, as though he had been waiting for her specifically, as though time moved at his discretion. His face was angular, composed, impossible to read. Black hair, dark eyes that caught the candlelight like still water. He was not smiling, but he was looking at her with the focused attention of someone encountering a problem they hadn't anticipated and found, against all expectation, interesting. He said nothing while she crossed the room. He let her come to him, not because he was performing dominance, but because she would understand later. He was genuinely watching her, studying the way she walked, the set of her chin, the way she did not look away. "Miss Greco," he said finally, and his voice was low and even, the kind that didn't need volume to fill a room. "Don Santini," she replied and extended her hand. He took it, a brief, formal touch, his fingers wrapping around hers for exactly 1 second before releasing. And in that single second something moved across his expression that was gone so quickly she wasn't sure she'd seen it. Like a door opening and immediately being closed. "Sit," he said. "Please." It was a small word, please, but it landed differently than she'd expected. She sat. Dinner was served by 2 staff members who moved with the practiced silence of people trained not to exist. The food was extraordinary, of course it was, but neither of them touched it immediately. Her father was seated to her left, making quiet conversation with a man named Marco who appeared to be Santini's consigliere, and she used that distraction to look directly at the man she was apparently going to marry. "You've done research on me," Raphael said, not a question. She met his eyes. Haven't you done research on me? Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. A recognition. More than is probably appropriate, he said. You graduated top of your class in economics at La Sapienza. You turned down a position in Milan to stay in Rome. You've never been in a serious relationship, which suggests either very high standards or very low trust. He picked up his wine glass and studied the color of it before looking back at her. Or both. She felt the heat of something, not quite offense, not quite flattery, rise at the base of her throat. And you, she said, keeping her voice entirely level, took over your father's organization at 26, tripled its holdings in 4 years, have been linked to 3 different women in the press in the last 2 years, but have never been photographed in the same place as any of them twice. She tilted her head slightly, which suggests either very low attachment or very high discretion. She paused. Or both. The not-quite smile deepened. I see, he said softly. I want to be very clear about something, Ariana said, and she set down her fork and looked at him with the full weight of her attention. I am not a settlement. I am not a peace offering or a business asset. If this is going to happen, and I haven't decided yet whether it is, then it will happen on terms that I agree to. Not terms you hand me. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was somehow the opposite, charged and still like the air before a storm decides what it wants to be. Raphael Santini looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down his own fork, mirroring her, and gave her his full attention the way you give something when you've decided it deserves it. Tell me your terms, he said. She hadn't expected that. She had prepared for resistance, negotiation, a display of power meant to remind her of her position. She had not prepared for genuine invitation. She kept her face neutral and said, I want my own space. A room that is mine and no one enters without permission. I want to continue working. I have interviews scheduled next week, and I will keep them. I want to be introduced as your wife, not your trophy, and I want to be spoken to as an equal in any room we share. She folded her hands on the table. And I want to know before any papers are signed, what you actually want from this. He was quiet for a moment. Then, security. For the alliance. And someone who won't flinch at the life. I don't flinch, she said. I know, he replied. That's part of why you're sitting there. It was not romantic. It was not tender. It was 2 people negotiating the terms of something that hadn't been asked for, with the kind of careful honesty that felt, in its own strange way, more intimate than softness would have. She told him she would give him an answer in 48 hours. He agreed without argument. She left the dinner feeling, for the first time in 2 days, like she had not entirely lost. She said yes. She would wonder, for months afterward, exactly why. It was not fear, she was certain of that. She had looked at Raphael Santini across that candlelit table and felt many things, but fear was not one of them. Caution, yes. Awareness, certainly. A complicated warmth in the vicinity of her chest that she refused to name. But not fear. The truth, the one she filed carefully away from conscious examination, was that something in his stillness had spoken to something in hers. That he had listened to her terms not with the patience of a man tolerating a woman's demands, but with the focus of someone taking notes. That when she'd looked at him directly and spoken plainly, he had not looked away. She said yes. And 2 weeks later, she married him in a small ceremony in a private chapel in the hills above Rome, with her father crying quietly in the 3rd pew and Marco standing at Raphael's side, expressionless as a statue. The dress was silk. Simple, elegant, unadorned. She had chosen it herself. Raphael had asked, through an intermediary, if there was anything she wanted for the ceremony. She had said flowers. Real ones. Not arrangements, just flowers, the loose wild kind like something from a field. The chapel was full of them. Ranunculus and anemone and olive branches, overflowing every surface, filling the stone room with the smell of living things. She had not expected him to remember something so small. She had not expected a lot of things about Raphael Santini. He was not what she had steeled herself for. She had arrived in his home, a large walled property on the outskirts of Rome, all stone floors and high ceilings and serious art, prepared for control. Prepared for doors that locked from the outside, rules she hadn't been told, restrictions dressed as protection. She had prepared to fight for every inch of space. What she found instead was a room with a lock she held the only key to, a standing desk already assembled by the window because someone had found out she preferred to work standing, and a note on the desk in handwriting that was precise and unexpectedly small. The kitchen staff are told you eat at 7. Tell them if you prefer otherwise. The Wi-Fi password is on the back of this page. Welcome. It was so aggressively practical that she stood in the middle of her room and laughed, once quietly, and then felt something bend in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine. She saw him at dinner. Every evening, without fail, he was there, sitting at the long table in the dining room, suited even at home, working through papers or simply sitting with a glass of wine and his own silence. He never summoned her. He never insisted. But the table was always set for 2, and when she appeared he would set down whatever he was reading and give her his attention, as though she'd arrived exactly when expected, and he was glad. They talked. That was the part she hadn't anticipated, the talking. Not small talk, not the hollow conversation of strangers maintaining politeness. Real conversation. He asked her about her interviews, remembered the names of the companies she'd applied to, asked follow-up questions the next day, as though he'd been thinking about what she'd said. She found herself looking forward to it with an intensity she resented. He did not touch her. He stood close, sometimes. Close enough that she was aware of the warmth radiating from him, close enough to catch the scent of cedar and something dark she never quite identified. But he kept his hands to himself with a deliberateness that felt almost like its own kind of language. As though he was telling her, without words, that the space between them would be hers to close or keep open on her timeline. 3 weeks after the wedding, she got a job offer. A real one, a junior analyst position at an international trade firm in Rome. Exactly the kind of work she'd studied for, the kind she'd been quietly terrified the marriage would bury. She told him at dinner, holding the letter, watching his face for the reaction she'd been braced for. The slight narrowing of eyes, the gentle reminder that her schedule was no longer entirely her own, the soft renegotiation of the terms she'd set. He looked at the letter, looked at her face, and said, "When do you start?" "Monday," she said carefully. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause, "You should celebrate. Is there something you want?" She stared at him. "You're not going to tell me it complicates things? Security-wise, schedule-wise." "I have staff for that," he said simply. "You spent 4 years working for this. Celebrate." That night she called her best friend Julia from her room and talked for 2 hours. And somewhere in the middle of explaining the dinner conversation, she stopped talking and pressed her hand flat against her sternum and stayed very quiet. "You like him," Julia said, not unkindly. "I don't trust him yet," Ariana said. It was the truest thing she could say. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Julia pointed out. She didn't answer. But she didn't disagree. The weeks settled into a rhythm. She worked. She came home to a house that was beginning to feel less like a cage and more like, she refused to say home yet, but something adjacent. Something with warmth in it. She had dinner with Raphael. They talked. Sometimes they sat in the library after dinner. She reading, he reviewing documents. In a silence so comfortable it unsettled her, because she had not known she could be this at ease in the presence of someone she hadn't chosen. She watched him when he wasn't looking. The way he moved through a room, unhurried, certain, as though the floor confirmed itself solid under each step. The way he spoke to his staff, direct, never unkind, with a quality of attention that made each person feel, she suspected, seen. The way he occasionally paused in whatever he was doing when she walked into a room, a brief involuntary stillness that she was probably imagining. She was probably imagining it. One evening, returning from work, she found a folder on her desk. No note, no explanation. Just a folder containing printed research on 3 companies in the trade sector, whose stock had been quietly consolidating over the last quarter, with handwritten margins notes pointing to patterns in the data. She opened her door and walked to the library where she knew he would be. He looked up. "Did you put this on my desk?" she asked, holding up the folder. "The patterns were interesting," he said. This took time," she said. She was still standing in the doorway, folder in hand, trying to locate the feeling spreading through her chest on any map she recognized. "This is my industry. You researched my industry." He looked at her for a moment. "You're good at it," he said. "I thought you'd want to see it." She stood there a moment longer than was necessary. Then she turned around and went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at nothing. She thought, "I am in serious trouble." The first sign of what was coming arrived on a Tuesday evening in the form of a man named Luca Ferrara. Ariana had met him at a work event, a quarterly gathering hosted by her firm where clients and analysts mingled over wine and formal small talk. Luca was a client, charming in the smooth, practiced way of men who'd learned early that their looks opened rooms, with dark eyes and an easy smile, and the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no and found it entertaining rather than instructive. He had made her laugh twice, which was impressive in a room where she was mostly managing professional distance. He had asked if she was married, and she had said yes, and he had said, "That's a shame," in a tone that landed somewhere between flattery and declaration, and she had given him her most professionally neutral smile and moved on. She told Raphael about it that evening. She told him because she felt obscurely that she should, that their arrangement, whatever it was evolving into, required honesty as a structural element. And because part of her wanted to watch his face. "He flirted with you," Raphael said. His voice was entirely even. "He made a comment," she said. "I didn't encourage it. I'm telling you because I thought you should know." He was very still. That particular stillness, the controlled kind, the kind that came from long practice at not showing what moved beneath the surface. He set down his pen and looked at her for a moment. "Did it bother you?" he asked. She blinked. "What? Did it bother you?" His attention. "No," she said slowly. "It was nothing. I'm telling you as a matter of courtesy," he finished. "Yes." He picked up his pen. "Thank you for telling me." She watched him for a moment. His jaw was very slightly set. His eyes had not returned to his document. "Raphael," she said. He looked up. "I'm not looking for a way out," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Something moved through his expression, deep and quick, like something surfacing and then deciding not to fully emerge. He looked at her with an intensity that was almost physical. "I know," he said. She went to bed that night thinking about the precise quality of those two words. What happened next was not dramatic. It was subtle, the way the most significant things often are, a shift in temperature rather than a change in weather. Luca Ferrara began appearing with more frequency. He had a reason to attend 3 of the events her firm hosted over the following month. He remembered her coffee order, mentioned it with a grin that implied he'd asked someone specifically. He was funny and perceptive and completely unambiguous about his interest, and Ariana managed him with the professional grace of a woman who knew exactly what was happening and had no intention of engaging it. But she noticed that Raphael's staff, particularly the quiet man named Gio who always seemed to exist at the edges of rooms, was occasionally present at those events. Always at a distance. Always doing nothing remotely visible. She confronted Raphael about it one evening with directness, because it was the only mode of communication she trusted. "You have someone watching me," she said. He didn't flinch. "I have someone ensuring your safety. I told you I wanted my own space." "Your own space," he said, "not an absence of protection. Those aren't the same thing. It feels like surveillance." "It's a different thing entirely," he said, and for the first time there was something close to intensity in his voice. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something urgent pushing through the calm. "Ariana, there are people who would use you to reach me. That is not a theoretical risk. I will not. I cannot leave you unprotected." She was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me," she said. Instead of, "Yes," he said immediately. "You're right. I should have told you." The concession was immediate, genuine, and it completely dismantled the argument she'd prepared. She stood there holding pieces of a fight that no longer had a shape. "I want to know," she said finally. "When there are decisions being made that affect my life. I want to be told." "Yes," he said again. And then, more quietly, "I'm not used to explaining myself." "Get used to it," she said. And something that was almost a smile, real this time, warmer than any she'd seen, moved across his face before he could stop it. That was the first time she smiled back. The argument, if it could be called that, changed something. A seam opened in the careful formality they'd been maintaining, and the version of themselves underneath started showing through in small ways. She started being more direct with him. Opinions offered freely, challenges made without apology. He started responding in kind, dropping the measured neutrality for something more alive. She learned he was a reader, obsessively so, the kind of person who had books in every room including the kitchen. She learned he cooked badly and enthusiastically, on Sunday mornings when most of his staff were off, and that he was entirely aware how bad he was and continued anyway. She learned he had a specific laugh, rare, surprised sounding, as though he hadn't seen it coming, that arrived occasionally in conversation and made her want to find what caused it again. She was falling. She knew it the way you know something you're not ready to admit out loud, as a fact that exists in the body, before it arrives in language. She was falling for a man she'd been handed to against her will. And the worst part, the part she turned over in the privacy of her room late at night, was that it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like discovery. On a Wednesday evening in November, Luca Ferrara appeared at a wine bar where she'd gone after work with two colleagues. Not an event, not a professional setting, just the wine bar around the corner from her office where she went sometimes to decompress. He appeared at her elbow 20 minutes in with a glass of something red and a smile that acknowledged the coincidence without pretending it was one. "Running into you again," he said. "Seems that way," she said. Her colleagues excused themselves with the particular delicacy of women who had clocked the situation and decided to be unhelpful. She set down her glass and looked at Luca Ferrara directly, because she had learned from her husband that the most efficient communication was usually direct. "I'm going to stop you before you build any more momentum," she said pleasantly. "I am married. I am not looking. I think you're charming, and I imagine that generally works out well for you, but it won't here." He studied her for a moment. "Is it a happy marriage?" he asked, and the question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than predatory calculation, which was somehow worse because it landed somewhere honest. She opened her mouth. Paused. "Yes," she said, and the word arrived before she decided to say it, instinctive, certain, with a warmth behind it that she felt in her face. "I think it is." He nodded, reading something in her expression she hadn't intended to put there. "He's a lucky man," he said simply, and took his glass and went back to where he'd come from. She sat for a moment looking at nothing. She thought, "I need to go home." She found Raphael in the library, as always. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and he had his jacket off for once, his sleeves rolled up, a pen behind his ear, papers spread across the wide table with the territorial confidence of a man deep in work. He looked up when she came in. "You're back early," he said. She stopped in the middle of the room. She had planned, in the car, to say something measured, something that acknowledged the evolution of their arrangement, something that opened a door without committing to walking through it. She had planned to be careful. Instead, she said, "I think I'm falling in love with you," and then stood there in the doorway looking absolutely horrified at herself. The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever heard. Raphael did not move. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, stripped of its composure in a way that made him look younger and, somehow, less powerful and far more real. The pen fell off his ear and neither of them noticed. He stood, slowly, like someone moving through something that required care. "Ariana," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different, lower, careful, like he was holding something fragile. "You don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "I said it because I needed to say it, not because I need you to respond to it. Our arrangement doesn't require." "Stop," he said. She stopped. He crossed the room. Slowly, unhurriedly, in that way he had of moving as though time had agreed to wait for him. He stopped close, closer than the careful distance he always kept, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up slightly to keep her eyes on his face. "I fell first," he said quietly. "By several months." She stared at him. "The night at dinner," he said. "When you handed me your terms." His voice was very low. "I sat across the table from you and thought, this woman is going to ruin me completely. And I wanted that." His jaw tightened slightly. "I have spent every day since then trying not to rush you, trying to give you the space you asked for, because you asked for it, and because every inch of it was earned." She felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully. The way light cracks through something when it finally finds the opening. "You researched my industry," she said softly. "I wanted to understand your world," he said, "because you were clearly going to keep it, and I wanted to understand everything about you." "Raphael, you don't have to say it again," he said. "You said it. I heard it." And then, as though he was offering it in return, "I would give up every inch of what I have before I let anything happen to you. That is not an exaggeration. That is the truest thing I know about myself at this particular moment." She reached up and put her hand against his face, just her palm against his jaw, a touch that was almost unbearably gentle given the weight of everything around it. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough for something enormous to move through him. Then his hand came up and covered hers, large and warm, fingers wrapping over hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his face. And they stayed like that in the library with the lamplight golden around them and the city quiet outside the windows. And she felt, For the first time since her father had come to her apartment with his hat in his hands and his debt in his eyes, entirely and exactly where she was supposed to be. Whatever came next, she thought, whatever was already moving toward them in the dark, she would face it knowing this. Knowing that this man, this complicated and difficult and quietly devoted man, had fallen first. Had held his breath and given her space and researched her industry and filled a chapel with field flowers and had somehow, in the least expected shape possible, become hers. She thought, I am not afraid anymore. She was wrong about that. Because 3 hours later, after the lamplight and the warmth and the long evening that ended in a fade of firelight and held breath and the soft close of a door, 3 hours later, Raphael's phone lit up on the kitchen counter with a message from an unknown number. And she saw his face when he read it. All the warmth drained out of him like water through a broken vessel. The man who had held her hand against his face and said I fell first was replaced in an instant by the other version. The still, controlled, dangerous version, the one that remembered who and what he was. He looked up and found her watching him. What is it? She asked. He set the phone face down on the counter. Very carefully. Nothing you need to worry about tonight. Raphael. He looked at her with those dark eyes and she saw it. Saw the specific quality of what was there. Not just control. Fear. Not for himself. She understood, with the terrible clarity of a woman who had spent months learning to read one man's silences, exactly what kind of fear it was. Tell me, she said. His jaw tightened. Someone knows, he said quietly, how much you matter to me, and they intend to use it. The warmth of the evening collapsed inward. She stood in his kitchen in bare feet with her hair loose and understood. Finally, the shape of the danger she had agreed to step into the night, she had said yes in a chapel full of field flowers. She thought, this is where everything changes. And she was right. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, or not only because of that, but because the fear had a particular shape she needed to understand before morning. She sat at her desk by the window with her lamp on low, and her thoughts moving in careful, deliberate lines, and she thought about Raphael's face when he read that message. The way something had shuddered behind his eyes. The way he had looked at her and, for the first time, shown her something he clearly didn't want her to see. He was scared for her. That, she thought, was the most terrifying part. Not the unknown threat, not the unnamed people who had sent that message in the dark. The terrifying part was that Raphael Santini, a man who sat at the center of a criminal empire with the calm composure of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't outlast, was scared. She went to him at midnight. He was in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door, still dressed, the untouched glass of whiskey on his desk indicating he'd been standing there for some time. He didn't turn when she came in, but his shoulders shifted slightly, the minimal acknowledgement of a man who knew exactly who had entered without needing to look. You should sleep, he said. Tell me what the message said, she replied, and sat down in the chair across from his desk in a posture that communicated clearly that she was not leaving. A long silence. Then he turned, and she saw the full weight of it on his face. The exhaustion underneath the control, the particular tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was beginning to feel the strain. He sat across from her and told her. The threat had come from a man named Victor Renko, a name that meant nothing to Ariana, but clearly meant something considerable to Raphael, given the precise economy with which he said it. Renko was a rival, an old one. The kind of old that came with history and grievance, and the particular patience of a man who had been waiting for the right leverage. For years, Raphael had been the kind of man who was difficult to threaten. No family, no vulnerabilities, no one he needed to protect with the specific, consuming urgency that made powerful men reckless. She had changed that. She had become, in the months since that candlelit dinner, the thing he couldn't replace. And Renko had been watching. What does he want? She asked. Territory, Raphael said. Business. He'll frame it as negotiation. And if you don't negotiate? He looked at her with the steady, careful attention of a man choosing exactly how much truth to hand across a table. Then he uses you to make me. She held that for a moment. Let it settle. Felt the cold of it move through her without flinching. Okay, she said. He stared at her. Okay. What's the plan? She said. You have one. I can see it in how you're sitting. Another long moment. And then something, not quite relief, but its precursor, moved through his expression. As though he had expected her to fragment, and she had refused to. And the refusal mattered in ways he hadn't known to anticipate. I need you to trust me for the next 48 hours, he said. I need you to do exactly what I tell you, go where I send you, and not argue the logistics in real time. He paused. I know that is not a natural condition for you. Despite everything, she felt the edge of a smile. It's not, she agreed. But I also know when to be strategic. What do you need from me? I need you to disappear, he said quietly. Not forever. 48 hours, maybe 72. I need you somewhere Renko can't find you while I remove the leverage he thinks he has. He looked at her. I need to know you're safe before I do anything else. Because if I'm worrying about you, I can't move clearly. And I need to move clearly. Where? She asked. He told her. A property in Umbria, high stone walls, staff he trusted more than family, completely off any record Renko's people might access. She would take Julia if she wanted. He had already thought of that, had already made the calculation that she would be less resistive if she wasn't alone. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had thought of Julia, who had planned for her resistance, who was sitting across from her at midnight telling her the truth, when every instinct in his world would have encouraged him to manage her instead. You could have just told me to go, she said. You could have framed it differently, made it sound routine. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? His eyes held hers. Because you made me promise to tell you when decisions were being made that affected your life, he said. I don't break promises. Especially not to you. She stood up, crossed the desk, stood directly in front of him, close enough that he had to look up at her, and she put both hands on his face. The same gesture as before, but different now, heavier, with the full weight of the night behind it. Come back from this, she said. His hands came up and covered hers. His grip was firm. His eyes, looking up at her, were stripped of everything except the truth. I will, he said. I swear it. She left for Umbria at 4 a.m. with Julia, 2 overnight bags, and the specific focus of a woman who had decided that being afraid and being capable were not mutually exclusive. The property was everything Raphael had promised. A walled estate nestled in the Umbrian hills, all terracotta and olive groves, and the particular silence of land that had been undisturbed for centuries. The staff were discreet, efficient, and clearly prepared. Her room had a window that looked out over the valley, and in the early dawn light it was so achingly beautiful that she stood at it for a long time and thought about Raphael alone in Rome doing whatever needed to be done. Julia, who had arrived at Ariana's doorstep at 3:30 a.m. with no questions and a bag she'd clearly packed before being called, sat on the bed behind her and said, "Tell me everything." So she did. She told Julia about the dinner and the terms and the chapel full of flowers, about the folder on the desk and the Sunday mornings with terrible cooking and the specific laugh she'd been trying to find again, about the library and what she'd said and what he'd answered, about the message and the midnight conversation and the way he'd held her hands against his face and said, "I will, I swear it." Julia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Ariana, you love him." "I know," she said. "No, I mean genuinely. The whole thing. Whatever he is, whatever this life is. You love him." She turned from the window. "Is that terrible?" "It's terrifying," Julia said honestly. "But no, it's not terrible." She paused. "Does he know?" "Not the falling, the whole thing. The depth of it." She thought about that. "I don't think I've shown him the whole depth yet." "When he comes back," Julia said, with the certainty of a woman who had decided Raphael Santini was coming back by sheer force of narrative conviction, "show him." She nodded, and turned back to the window and the valley and the early light moving over the hills, and she thought, "Come back. Please come back." In Rome, Raphael moved. He had 48 hours and a problem that had been building for 3 years, and a man on the other side of it who had made the catastrophic error of reaching toward the one thing Raphael could not be rational about. Renko had miscalculated, and he would understand that soon enough. Raphael spent the first 12 hours in a series of conversations. Some held in offices, some in cars, one in the back of a restaurant in Trastevere that had been cleared of all other occupants. Marco was at his side through most of it, reading the room with the quiet accuracy of a man who had spent 20 years learning to anticipate what Raphael needed before he asked. "You're different," Marco said, during a brief window between meetings, the two of them standing in the courtyard of the Trastevere property with espresso and the particular exhaustion of men running on intent. "Different how?" Raphael said. "Not a question. When this kind of thing has come up before," Marco said carefully, "you've been cold. Strategic. Entirely in your head." He glanced at Raphael. "You're angry this time." I'm always strategic, Raphael said. Yes, but now you're angry and strategic, Marco said. Which is different. Angry strategic men make faster decisions. He paused. Also bolder ones. Raphael looked at him for a moment. Is that a concern? No, Marco said. It's an observation. She's good for you, boss. Even like this. He gestured vaguely at the situation. Raphael said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes. He made his bolder decision on the evening of the first day. Renko had expected negotiation. He had sent the message as an opening move, a placement of pieces on a board, confident that Raphael would respond by entering the game. What Raphael did instead was refuse the frame entirely. He contacted 3 men who had been waiting for an opportunity to move against Renko for their own reasons. Men with grievances, men with old scores, men whose loyalty could be secured not with money, but with the right removal, and he offered them the terms they needed. He was dissolving Renko's ground from beneath him before Renko knew the conversation had changed. It was not a clean or gentle process. It was the kind of thing that happened in the city's unseen rooms, in the particular language of men who had built their lives on the management of force. Raphael spent those hours in a version of himself that he had never shown Ariana. Not because he was hiding it, but because this part of him was the cost of everything else, the weight on the other side of the scale, the thing he hoped someday she could understand without needing to watch him live it. By the second day, Renko was isolated. By the evening of the second day, Renko was aware of it. And a man who has been quietly encircled without realizing it, who reaches for the leverage he believes he holds and finds it has already been removed, loses most of his power in that single moment of understanding. Renko called. Raphael answered. The conversation was brief. Raphael spoke with the steady certainty of a man who had already finished the game and was simply communicating the result. He did not threaten. He did not need to. He told Renko that his reach toward Ariana had cost him more than any territory negotiation would have gained him, and that if her name or safety entered anyone's calculation again, the next communication would not be a phone call. Then he hung up. He sat in the silence of his study for a moment, in the dark, with the weight of 48 hours pressing down on his shoulders. He thought of Ariana standing at her desk the night he'd met her, reading the folder he'd left. You researched my industry, with her voice doing that thing it did when she was trying to manage a feeling that had arrived bigger than expected. He picked up his phone and called Marco. Get the car, he said. We're going to Umbria. She heard the car before she saw it, tires on the gravel drive, the specific sound of arrival in the late afternoon quiet of the estate. She was in the garden when it happened, standing among the olive trees that ran along the south wall, having been in the garden for an hour for no better reason than that it was the only thing that had kept her hands from shaking. She told herself she wasn't waiting. She had been standing in gardens before, and she could stand in them again without it meaning anything about how thoroughly a person could occupy her thoughts even from a distance of several hundred kilometers. She heard the car door. She walked through the garden gate into the drive. Raphael was standing by the car in the amber light of 4 o'clock, his jacket over one arm, looking like a man who had not slept in 2 days, which he hadn't. He looked up when she came through the gate and something in his posture shifted, a release barely visible, the kind that comes when a person who has been braced against catastrophe finally processes that the catastrophe did not arrive. She crossed the gravel. She was going to say something measured. She was going to ask about the situation, confirm it was resolved, maintain the composed and functional version of herself that had gotten her through the last 72 hours without fragmenting. Instead, she closed the remaining distance between them, put her arms around him, pressed her face against his chest, and held on with the specific fierceness of someone who had been very good at being fine and was temporarily done with it. His arms came around her immediately. Both of them. Tight, closer than he'd ever held her before, his chin dropping to the top of her head, and she felt the whole length of the exhale that moved through him. Long and slow and profound, like something enormous being set down. They stood in the gravel drive in the Umbrian afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It's done, she asked eventually into his chest. It's done, he said. Renko won't reach for you again. What did you do? Remove the ground from under him, he said. Strategically. Completely. Without anything that would, he paused. Nothing I'm not able to look at you and tell you about. She pulled back enough to look at his face. She searched it. He let her, openly, with nothing closed against her. This man who spent most of his life managing exactly what he showed the world, giving her all of it without reservation. I believe you, she said. Something moved through him at that. Something profound and quiet. There's something I need to tell you, he said. His voice was different, lower, more deliberate, like a man approaching the most important sentence he'd said in years. I need to tell you now, clearly, without the urgency of a threat or the adrenaline of a crisis. I need to say it when everything is still, so you understand it's the truest version. She waited. I love you, he said. Simple and direct and without decoration, the way he said everything that actually mattered. I am in love with you in a way that has reorganized every priority I have. When that message came, when I understood what Renko intended, the only clear thought I had was that nothing on earth was worth anything if it cost me you. He looked at her steadily. Not the empire. Not the alliances. Not the reputation I've spent 15 years building. None of it. She had heard him say he fell first. She had heard him say he would give up every inch. But this, still clear, in the afternoon light of the Umbrian hills, looking at her with eyes that held nothing back, this was different. This was the whole of it, offered without armor. She reached up and took his face in her hands again. By now it was their language, this gesture, her palms against his jaw, the tactile fact of being close enough to feel the warmth of him. I love you, she said. Not the arrangement. Not what you provide. You, the person who researches my industry and fills chapels with field flowers and burns eggs on Sunday mornings and tells me the truth at midnight when lying would have been easier. She felt her voice steady itself. I love the version of you that held his breath for months, trying not to rush me. I love that version completely. He closed his eyes for a single long second. When he opened them, the expression there was the most unguarded she had ever seen on a human face. He leaned down and kissed her. Not urgently, not desperately, but with the profound deliberateness of a man who had been waiting long enough and had earned this specific moment. She kissed him back with the full weight of everything. The months of careful distance and slow recognition and midnight conversations and the fear of the last 72 hours and the relief of right now. Around them, the olive trees held their silver-green stillness, and the afternoon light moved across the valley below, and somewhere in the house Julia, who had absolutely been watching from the window, made a sound that was probably not audible from outside. They stayed in Umbria for 2 more days. Not because of any remaining danger. Raphael had been clear and thorough, and Renko was, by all accounts, occupied with the significant structural collapse of his own operation. They stayed because both of them understood, without saying it directly, that those 2 days were a kind of necessary breathing space. A place outside the weight of Rome and the Empire and the life they were returning to, where they could exist simply as 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely architecture of circumstance and had chosen to stay. They walked in the mornings on the paths that ran through the estate and down toward the valley. They cooked dinner together, or she cooked and he attempted, with the enthusiastic incompetence that made her laugh so hard she had to sit down. Julia, who had decided she adored Raphael with the comfortable certainty of someone who had been watching the situation develop for months and was vindicated, joined them for meals and contributed to the conversation with the easy warmth of a woman who understood that her presence had been specifically anticipated and appreciated. On the second evening, after Julia had gone to bed and the kitchen was cleaned and the Umbrian night was settled around the house in its deep, unhurried quiet, they sat together on the stone terrace with wine and the particular comfort of people who have found that silence in the company of another person can be its own form of fullness. I want to talk about what comes next, Ariana said. He looked at her. Tell me what you want from it. She had thought about this, had been thinking about it, in the spaces between the crisis and the relief, with the same careful methodology she brought to everything. I want to understand your world, she said. Not be shielded from it. Not be managed around the edges of it. I want to understand what you carry so I can not carry it with you necessarily, but know its shape. So I'm not always receiving information in crisis rather than context. She paused. I am an intelligent woman. I work in risk assessment professionally. Stop protecting me from information and let me be a partner in the actual life we're living. He was quiet for a moment. That world has costs, he said. Knowing it changes things. I'm already changed, she said. I spent 72 hours in Umbria knowing someone had targeted me because of who I married. The information about why doesn't change the fact. It just lets me be useful instead of passive. He looked at her in the dark for a long moment, with that focused attention that still had the power to make her feel like the most significant thing in whatever room, or terrace, they occupied. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay, you want to understand the operation, he said. I'll teach you. He paused. Not everything at once. Some of it requires context. But yes, Raphael, you're my wife, he said. And the word, not wife in the sense of possession, but wife in the sense of person I chose, person I trust, person I am building a life with, landed in the space between them with a weight and a warmth that was entirely new. You are not an appendage. You are not a liability to be managed. I have been treating you with care, but perhaps not always with the full respect your intelligence deserves. He looked at her steadily. That changes. She looked at him in the dark. She thought, this is the man. This is the version of him that exists when he stops being careful and starts being real. Thank you, she said softly. He reached across and took her hand. The way he held it was simple, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, almost absent-mindedly, the gesture of a man comfortable enough to touch her without occasion. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that under the Umbrian stars until the wine was finished and the night had deepened and neither of them wanted to move. They returned to Rome on a Thursday morning, and the city received them with its usual indifference. The traffic, the noise, the layered beautiful chaos of a place that had outlasted every empire and had opinions about nothing. But the house was different. Or rather, she was different in it. She walked through the front door and moved through the familiar rooms. The library, the kitchen, the long dining room, the hallway with the art she'd spent months learning to read. And it settled around her not like a property she occupied, but like a place that held her. The distinction was subtle and enormous simultaneously. Her desk still had the standing configuration by the window. The Wi-Fi password note was still on the back of an index card tacked to the wall. The library still had 2 reading chairs positioned at the angle she preferred. All of it had been arranged from the beginning, with her specific comfort in mind, and she had known this intellectually for months. But standing in it now, on the other side of everything, she felt it differently. This had been love in the practical form. Long before the library and the confession and the Umbrian terrace. Love expressed as standing desk and she eats at 7 and field flowers, not arrangements. Love expressed as research folders and Sunday morning terrible eggs and a man who held his breath for months giving her space she'd asked for because she'd asked for it. She went to the library and stood in the middle of it. Raphael found her there 10 minutes later. He came to stand beside her, close, his shoulder almost touching hers, looking at the room with her. Are you all right? He asked. I'm thinking about how long you were in love with me before I understood it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Does that bother you? No, she said. It makes me want to make sure the next chapter is clearer. She turned to look at him. I want a real marriage. Not an arrangement that evolved into warmth. A real one, where I'm a partner and you're a partner, and we build something that's actually ours. We already have that, he said. We have the foundation, she corrected gently. Now I want the building. He looked at her with those dark, still eyes, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do with intention before. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, slow and careful, the way you touch something you're glad is real. His hand stayed at her face afterward, his palm warm against her cheek. Then let's build it, he said. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Not easier. Life in Raphael Santini's orbit was never simple, and she understood that now fully, without romanticizing it. But more honest. More integrated. She began to understand the structure of what he managed, the layers of it, the human geography of alliances and tensions and history. He explained carefully, with the patience of a man who had found that sharing weight made it lighter rather than more distributed. She asked good questions. She had always asked good questions. And the quality of them clearly gave him a specific kind of satisfaction, the kind that comes from being understood rather than merely informed. She also, separately, became very good at recognizing the men who worked for him. Not because she was looking for threats, but because she understood now that the world she moved through had layers she could either be blind to or literate in, and she preferred literacy. Gio, who had been her quiet shadow at professional events, became a familiar face she could acknowledge with a nod. The other staff, the serious-faced woman who managed the household, the driver named Cesare who had opinions about Rome's traffic that he would share at considerable length given the opportunity, became people rather than furniture. She learned their names. She remembered their details. She asked about Cesari's daughter's school play and about the serious-faced woman's mother's hip surgery, and the warmth that came back was genuine and unguarded and made the house feel, even more, like something inhabited by people rather than managed by a structure. Raphael watched all of this with the expression she was beginning to understand was his version of open joy, quiet, controlled, but warm enough to be felt at a distance. "You're doing the thing," he said one evening. "Which thing?" she said. "The thing where you make people feel seen and they would walk through fire for you afterward," he said. "You've done it to my entire household. Gio follows you around like a loyal dog, and he's never followed anyone in 20 years of employment." "I just talk to them," she said. "You listen to them," he corrected. "Most people just talk." She looked at him. "You listen," she said. "I learned from you," he said. She felt warmth move through her and said nothing, and he picked up his wine with the understated satisfaction of a man who had gotten away with something. 2 months after Umbria, she missed her period. She sat with this information for 3 days in the particular private processing space she maintained inside even the fullest life, turning it over, examining it, feeling the shape of it against all the other shapes in her chest. There was fear in it, genuine and tender. There was also something enormous and warm that moved underneath the fear like a current and kept threatening to surface. On the 4th day, she told him. She did it at dinner, which was their place, their table, their light, their established territory of honest conversation. She waited until the meal was finished and the table was cleared and they were sitting with the last of the wine, and then she said quietly, "I think we might be having a baby." He went very still. Not the controlled stillness, the other kind. The involuntary kind. The kind that happens when something reaches through every layer of composure and lands directly on the soft center of a person. "Think," he said carefully, "or no." "I took 2 tests," she said. "Both positive." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched everything that moved through his face, the sequence of it, fast and complex. Processing. Then something that was larger than any expression she'd seen on him, warmer, with a quality of wonder that she would have called boyish if the word weren't entirely at odds with the man. His eyes were very bright. "Ariana," he said. "I know it wasn't." "Ariana," he said again, and stood and crossed the table and took her hands from where they'd been folded in her lap, drawing her to her feet. He held her hands between both of his and looked at her face with an intensity that was made entirely of something tender. "Tell me how you feel about it." "Terrified," she said honestly. "And also," she paused, looking for the word, "ready. In a way I didn't expect. In a way that feels like it arrived before I did." He closed his eyes briefly. His grip on her hands tightened. "I have never wanted anything the way I want this," he said quietly. "Not the empire, not any of it. I want this. I want you and whatever we're building and every morning that comes with both." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I know the life is complicated. I know what I carry and what that means for a child. I want to spend the rest of whatever I have making it worthy of both of you." She felt the tears before she decided to cry. Involuntary, warm, not from grief but from the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. A forced marriage. Terms negotiated across a candlelit table. A chapel full of field flowers. A folder of industry research on a standing desk. A library at midnight. Umbrian hills and olive trees, and the man standing in front of her who had fallen first and held his breath and learned to share his weight, and was now holding her hands at their dinner table looking at her, like she was the answer to every calculation he'd ever run. She put her arms around him. He wrapped both of his around her, pulling her in with the specific quality of a man who has understood that the thing he is holding is his whole life. "Promise me something," she said into his shoulder. "Anything," he said. The word arrived without hesitation. "Keep telling me the truth," she said. "Even when it's hard. Especially then. No managing, no shielding. Just truth." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Always," he said. "From now forward. Always." They stood there in the dining room in the Roman night, the wine unfinished, the world outside continuing its indifferent business, and she felt the full architecture of it. The unlikely and complicated and beautiful structure of a life she had not chosen but had built, stone by stone, from the material she'd been handed, into something entirely and undeniably hers. In the weeks that followed, Rome settled into winter, and the house became warmer. Not metaphorically, though that too, but literally, physically warmer. Fires in the library each evening, the kitchen generating the steady warmth of actual cooking as Raphael doubled down on his Sunday morning enterprise with a determination that improved the results marginally and made her laugh considerably. Julia came to dinner twice and left both times with the contented expression of someone watching a story she'd invested in reach a good chapter. Ariana began to show, barely, in the way that only she could see, a softness, a fullness, a bodily fact that she stood in front of the mirror and regarded with something that had moved over weeks from anxiety to wonder. Raphael noticed in the specific attentive way he noticed everything about her, with the detail-oriented care of a man who had spent months studying the person in front of him. He said nothing, because he understood she needed to hold it for herself first. But he was there consistently and quietly, the way he had always been there. Close enough to be felt, far enough to allow space, present in the ways that mattered. He came to her one evening in the library with a small box. She looked at it, then at him. "We were married in a chapel with 2 witnesses and a document," he said, standing in front of her with the box in his hands, entirely still in the way that meant he was managing something enormous underneath. "I want to do it again. Properly. Whatever that means to you, large, small, quiet, loud. I want to marry you again with the full knowledge of who you are and who we are to each other." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not the formal one that had accompanied their arrangement, but a different one entirely. Simple, extraordinary, a single emerald set in gold, the color of the Umbrian hills in the afternoon light. "I chose this," he said. "Not as a transaction. Not as a settlement." His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "As a man who is in love with his wife and wants her to know it every day for the rest of his life." She looked at the ring, looked at him, felt the whole weight of it, the arc of everything. From a back seat of a car she hadn't chosen through a dinner and a negotiation and a chapel and a crisis and a kitchen and a library and a terrace and an olive grove and back here, to this room, to this man, standing in front of her with a ring the color of hills and a face that held nothing back. "You already know my terms," she said softly. "Tell me again," he said. "I like hearing them." She took the ring from the box and held it for a moment, the weight of it, the cool specificity of it. Then she looked at him. "Equal," she said. "In every room." "Yes," he said. "Truth always." "Yes. And you keep burning the eggs on Sunday mornings." Something moved through him, that specific, rare, surprised-sounding laugh, arriving full and unguarded, and she felt it in the center of her chest like something warm being poured. "Non-negotiable," he said. She held out her hand. He took it, with both of his careful, the way you hold something that contains everything, and slid the ring onto her finger. The library was warm. The fire was low. Outside, Rome continued being itself, layered and ancient and entirely unbothered. And somewhere in the house a clock marked the hour, and the city moved through its winter evening. And none of it had any idea that in a room full of books 2 people who had been handed to each other by circumstance had chosen each other completely, freely, without condition or caveat or the shadow of obligation. She looked at the ring on her hand. She looked at Raphael Santini, this complicated, devoted, dangerous, tender, obsessively attentive man who had filled a chapel with field flowers and researched her industry and sat at dinner every evening without fail because being at the table was a form of saying, "I am here. I am choosing this. I am choosing you." And she understood something that had been assembling itself in her for months. She had been handed to him against her will. And she had taken that material, all of it, the coercion and the complication and the power and the fear and the slow, astonishing revelation of who he was. And she had built something from it that was entirely and utterly hers. She had not survived the arrangement. She had transformed it. She had changed the game. "Come here," she said. He stepped forward and she took his face in her hands, their language the first and most essential one, and looked at him with the full weight of everything she was, everything she'd been, everything they were becoming. "I love you," she said. "For all of it. Every complicated, difficult, extraordinary inch." He put his hands over hers. "I love you," he said. "For telling me your terms. For not flinching. For making my house into a home without being asked and for demanding the truth when I would have preferred to manage you and for laughing at my eggs." His voice was very quiet. "For staying." She leaned forward and kissed him, long and unhurried, in the warmth of the library, with the winter outside the windows and a fire at their backs, and the future arranging itself around them like something that had always been intended. And outside, Rome held its ancient, indifferent, beautiful breath. And inside, everything was exactly as it should be. Thanks so much for reading. And for listening. If this story moved you, made you feel something, made you stay up past your bedtime, please like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this one exist because of you. Until the next one.